This is a thermal map of the Earth, showing the current temperatures across different regions. If we start by looking at the North Pole, the average temperature there is around -3 degrees Celsius to -6 degrees Celsius. While this is extremely cold, it's not the coldest place on Earth. As we move to the opposite side of the planet, to the South Pole, something very strange happens. The temperatures here plummet to an astounding -50 degrees Celsius to -60 degrees Celsius, making Antarctica not only around 10 times colder than the North Pole, but also one of the coldest places in the entire solar system. Now, you might wonder why there's such a huge difference in temperature between the two poles, especially since both the North Pole and the South Pole receive nearly the same amount of sunlight. The question remains, why is the South Pole, or Antarctica, so much colder than the North Pole? Here's another fascinating fact. When you stand at the North Pole, you're not actually standing still. Due to the Earth's constant rotation, you're moving about 10 to 20 kilometers without even realizing it. You can even track your movement on Google Maps. This is because the ice at the North Pole is floating on the Arctic Ocean, and the water beneath the ice moves slowly, causing the ice itself to shift slightly over time. Now, let's zoom out and look at the three largest deserts on Earth: the Arctic, the Antarctic, and the Sahara. Yes, it might be surprising, but both the snow-covered Arctic and Antarctic are scientifically classified as deserts. Most people think deserts are hot and sandy, but the scientific definition of a desert is any region that receives less than 250 millimeters of precipitation, rain, or snow per year. In the case of Antarctica, this number is just 150 millimeters annually, while the Arctic gets between 150 and 250 millimeters per year. So, both polar regions are incredibly dry, much like the Sahara Desert. These places are so extreme that very little life, whether plant or animal, can survive there. But what makes the Arctic and Antarctic deserts unique is the dramatic changes in daylight. During winter at the poles, you experience something called polar night, where the sun doesn't rise for months. Then, during the summer, you get the midnight sun, when the sun doesn't set for months. For example, at the North Pole, polar night begins around December 21st, when the sun stays below the horizon for 24 hours straight, leading to continuous darkness for months. At the South Pole, polar night starts on June 21st and continues for a similar duration. The reverse happens during the summer. In the Arctic, the sun stays above the horizon for months, starting on June 21st. And in Antarctica, this happens from December 21st. So, for 6 months, the sun never sets, bathing the poles in continuous daylight. Now, let's talk about the animals living in these extreme environments. The North Pole, or Arctic, is home to various creatures that have adapted to the freezing conditions. You'll find animals like polar bears, Arctic foxes, snowy owls, Arctic hares, wolves, reindeer, and many other species. These animals have developed special adaptations to thrive in the harsh cold. But when we look at the South Pole, or Antarctica, the situation is very different. Antarctica is one of the most barren places on Earth, with very few animals surviving on the land itself. Some small creatures like worms, insects, and mollusks can be found in certain areas, but most of the wildlife in Antarctica lives in the surrounding ocean. In the icy waters of the Antarctic Ocean, you'll find whales, seals, penguins, and seabirds like the albatross. One of the biggest differences between the Arctic and Antarctica is the presence of plant life. The Arctic region supports about 2,200 species of vascular plants, while Antarctica is so harsh that only 2 to 3 types of plants can survive there. These include some types of grass and small mosses. So while the Arctic still has some greenery, Antarctica is almost entirely devoid of plants. Now, let's talk about humans. Can we survive in these extreme environments? Surprisingly, humans have been living in the Arctic for about 20,000 years. The indigenous peoples of Greenland, Canada, and Alaska have adapted to the extreme cold, developing ways to survive and thrive in this environment. Today, the Arctic is home to about 4 million people, and you'll even find modern cities and towns in some parts. However, when it comes to Antarctica, things are very different. No evidence of permanent human habitation has ever been found in Antarctica. The first explorers only discovered this frozen continent in the 18th century, and many lost their lives trying to map it. Even today, very few people live there, and those who do are mostly scientists conducting research in specialized stations. Due to the extreme cold and dangerous weather, living in Antarctica is nearly impossible for humans. One of the key differences between the North and South Poles lies beneath the surface. The North Pole is not located on solid land, but on a floating ice sheet above the Arctic Ocean. This ocean is surrounded by land masses from countries like Russia, the United States, Canada, and Greenland. Because the North Pole is surrounded by land and the ocean below the ice is relatively warm, it helps to moderate the temperature, preventing the region from becoming as cold as Antarctica. In contrast, the South Pole sits on solid land in the middle of Antarctica, a massive continent covered by an ice sheet that's up to 5 kilometers thick in some places. Because this ice sits on land, it doesn't melt as quickly as the ice at the North Pole. The thick ice sheet also reflects most of the sunlight, keeping the temperature incredibly low. Additionally, Antarctica is completely isolated, surrounded by the cold waters of the Southern Ocean. There are no large land masses nearby to provide warmth, and the cold winds from the ocean continuously sweep across the continent, making it even colder. Another factor is the elevation. Antarctica is the highest continent on Earth, with an average elevation of about 2,500 meters, 8,200 feet, above sea level. This high altitude contributes to the extreme cold because, as we know, temperatures drop the higher you go. In comparison, the Arctic is at a much lower altitude, which helps keep its temperatures warmer than Antarctica. So, even though both poles get similar amounts of sunlight, the unique geography and environmental conditions make Antarctica the coldest place on Earth. This is why the South Pole is much more extreme and colder than the North Pole. I hope this answers your question about why Antarctica is so much colder than the Arctic. If you enjoyed this video and learned something new, be sure to like, share, and subscribe for more fascinating facts. See you in the next episode